Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Freshagenda, Ever.Ag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back with a bit of a quick update this week. We missed last week, just a few market updates. Obviously, a rundown on GDT event number 384 and, of course, Joe of the Week.
Bit of a shorter agenda, Joe. We're at the beach, so we don't have much tolerance for too much detail.
Still working. So first of all, in Europe, and we're seeing cream really weakening in the spot market in the last couple of weeks, particularly last week. Forward prices for butter, as a result, quite weak as well. Over-the-counter trades that were booked for Q4 25 are even lower than this. Part of the reason, Steve, is there's a bit more product around from Ireland, and that's certainly having an impact on still very elevated prices for butter in Europe.
It's a year-on-year increase, isn't it? Because the milk production's bounced back from last year, and so butter is also surging in the output.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Across to the US, cheese futures certainly noticeably drifting weaker in the past 2 weeks. Cheese supplies are building. We had a conversation about this morning with our team over there that, while exports have been better, it's still a mountain to climb in terms of the availability that's approaching. And look, domestic signals aren't improving, and you'll have a bit to say about that later. The butter market is also weaker. It's getting back into that buying zone for late year business. Now, we've seen, 3 weeks of pretty stable forward prices, and we've seen it drop down. So, in the background, Joe, cream's tightening quite a bit in the US. Summer heat is certainly burning into supplies, and, that works on both sides. So milk, spot milk has lifted, and we're seeing, ice cream demand really fire up with the heat.
Yeah, so that glut is definitely drying up, Steve.
In the rear view. So over to GDT 384, and look, quite a mostly positive. The index went up 1.1%, the first time it's gone up in 5 events after some pretty solid declines in recent weeks. But this chart, it gets worse as you go further to the right, just the way we usually lay this out. Powder's improved after a few knocks. Fat you'd have to say mixed, and we'll talk about the detail. It is certainly mixed, and cheese continuing to slide. And when we focus on the fats and cheese changes with the different regions into this, the New Zealand butter futures are still well below these numbers that are achieved on GDT. We'll show that towards the end of this segment. EU butter, interestingly, Joe, ended 200 euros a tonne below the September 25 futures. So, the actual trades, again, showing that the futures market's not in touch with where things are. And in terms of mozzarella from Europe, quite mixed there. We saw quite different changes for the two major suppliers, certainly in that C2 delivery period. So it's trading, if you take those two into account, trading between the equivalent of $2.13 and $2.70 a pound in US terms. And when you can see the US short-term market is below $1.70, it's still quite a gap.
Yeah, interesting, Steve. We're sort of kind of drifted back into a usual seasonal volume profile at the moment. We did see that big step up in availability, but at the moment we're pretty much on par with previous years. Good demand at these volumes, best seen in whole milk powder for quite a while. And again, it's encouraging given the seasonal lift in offer volumes. Butter remained pretty strong, but not enough to actually lift that overall curve at this event, Steve.
Yeah. So getting into a bit of the product result areas, partial recovery in whole milk powder. It was virtually no change in the second contract, but the later periods were a bit more optimistic. Look, there's a big lift in volumes at the next event. So we talked about that in our last video, that's 2 weeks ago, about the impact of that, the potential impact of that, and just the size of that uplift. So this will be pretty interesting to watch where it goes from here as to whether there's a good recovery in demand, but is it going to be there to that extent?
Just looking at who was buying, Steve, Chinese involvement was a little bit lower than the previous event this time around, although that chart is in tonnes, so it is ahead of the previous couple of years for this same event.
Yeah, a little earlier, isn't it?
That's right. And for Southeast Asia, that involvement kind of recovered, but again, still very low compared to previous years on the platform.
Yeah.
And here we go. Middle East is reliably coming back when they see an opportunity with lower prices. They tend to increase their involvement, Steve, and we see this pattern repeated at the moment.
Yeah, it's like the best price availability for something like 12 events if you backtrack through through that history. So, yeah, it is enticing them back. And in general, trade volume has been quite low into that region.
Yes.
Pretty firm result for skim milk cattle, really, when you look at it that way. New Zealand's still pretty good value. When we line up the regions, the supply regions, you'll see that they've got a strong advantage in price terms. But here, that's showing a good lift across forward curves.
Yeah, it's certainly flattened out compared to last time.
And when you look at the alternate suppliers, there's a little separation developed between the top and bottom of that range, but still fairly tight between Fonterra and Solaric prices in US dollars.
Just looking again at the buying trends for skim milk powder, China, a bit mixed. Purchases were still pretty low. Seen quite a bit of imported product in general trade, Steve. So, and very high stocks to use ratio that we've seen just out of the latest report from China. So it's little wonder really that the involvement for skim is not higher. And for Southeast Asia, buying is coming back and also reviving in more general trade, Steve. So just a little bit better demand out of Southeast Asia at the moment.
It's a tall order to beat next time round, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Looking at the butter result, it's like a tilt occurred in the butter forward curve. It came down in short term and lifted later. So we've had a couple of events with pretty sharp backwardation in the curve. And these short-term prices go all the way back to March, April. So we've seen a bit of a retreat here. China again took the largest parcel after which it did last time. So that buying is persisting, even though they're small volumes. IMF, a bit of a similar trend. That curve's flattened out, but it has been generally flatter for some months. We only really saw that big anomaly last time with a huge C1 price that got reversed in these results.
Yeah, and just looking at this comparison, Steve, that gap between butter and AMF has closed a little, but it narrows a lot when you're looking at forward prices. So there it's, what's that, around $2,000 a tonne. The gap drops to about $1,200 a tonne as you get further out on that curve. So interesting what's happening with the butterfat market at the moment, Steve.
Yeah, as we're heading to a new New Zealand season. So where does this leave us? So in terms of skim, clearly, as we said, New Zealand pricing is the cheapest. GDT achieving a little better than the forward futures curve in some of those early contracts, but that's quite an odd result in those later periods in GDT this time. Maybe a reflection, there's a lack of concern about availability when we get out there and later in the year. The growth indicators in New Zealand are a bit mixed at present, so, that'll be interesting to watch. And the EU is firmer in US dollar terms with a weaker US dollar in this week's trade.
And just looking at the butterfat comparison, forward prices for Europe, New Zealand and butter and the US have all shifted lower. But the exception there, Steve, again, is AMF, which, just steadied a bit in the latest results.
Just showing a comparison here, we haven't used this very often, comparing the GDT outcomes to where the block cheddar spot market is in the US, which is the green line, and obviously well below and heading down again. So that's widening the advantage. You see the orange line, which is mozzarella from Europe, seems to be following it, doesn't it? Like heading down. But sudden drop, and this has been going on since May, a sudden drop in the New Zealand cheddar price. Probably, was sitting up at unrealistic levels. We're now coming back to the pack with a bit more pressure on that export competition. So chart of the week, Joe, what have you got?
Yeah, we're back in the States, Steve. Just looking at some data on cheese demand, we got the domestic commercial disappearance data this week. This is just looking at cheese demand per capita, and it's still pretty weak there, Steve. There's been a bit of a shift between types, and that really reflects the shifting channels out of home, including fast food, which is mostly, favourable to mozzarella, has continued to be pretty weak. Retail is close to flat, and that's really feeding into those cheddar numbers. And obviously, there's a lot more availability of cheddar as well, Steve. But a pretty flat story, isn't it, for cheese? And just looking at the same data, rolling annual per capita usage, and this is based on official US population data. It looks like it's peaked in 2022, Steve, and it's just drifting a bit weaker. And we were just talking about an interesting report that's just come out of the Federal Reserve of Dallas, I think.
Yeah, that's great.
With some scenarios for population growth following the mass deportations that have been threatened and have started, and what that looks like in terms of population growth. And it's basically looking like no population growth for the foreseeable future. So that's certainly going to have an impact on overall cheese demand, Steve.
Yeah, so the per capita's got to lift, or else we're into a scenario where demand is going to continue to remain weak. Quite interesting. Okay, well, that's all from us this week. We'll be back again next week. Don't forget to click on this or scan this code if you want to look at our new Global Insights products.
For free.
For free. Try them out. Let us know. Anyway, we'll be back, and thanks again for watching.